So what we got to do next is we got to talk about consumer and producer surplus. Okay, just like we have consumer and surplus in a perfect competitor, we also got to worry about consumer and producer surplus in a monopoly. And the reason being is because that consumer surplus that we get is good. We like that. And the producers like getting producer surplus. And so we've got to be able to compare and contrast the two, which we'll get to eventually here. All right, so if I were to draw just a regular old supply and demand curve, so this would be a market. You know, to show consumer producer surplus, we go ahead and run the demand curve all the way to the axes, and we run the supply curve all the way to the axes, ceteris paribus, right, to make it easy on you. And we find our price and quantity. Where's my consumer surplus? Everything priced to the demand curve. So that's all my consumer surplus, right? Where's my producer surplus? Price to the supply curve, yes. So that is my consumer surplus. I need to do a little bit careful job filling it in so I don't go past the things, but so that's my producer surplus, right? All right, so now if we take a monopoly here, we're going to do the exact same thing here. We're going to go ahead and run our demand curve all the way to and our MR curve all the way down to the thing. And in actuality, those guys should intersect at a quantity of 1. So we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and we're going to do that. And you can see that's actually a quantity of 1. It's just we're producing millions of units here, so you can't even tell where it is right there. It actually isn't touching the vertical axis. It's just at a quantity of 1. Okay, ceteris paribus just makes it easier on you guys. So what we got to do now is we got to figure out where is my consumer surplus. You tell me. Everywhere from price to the demand curve. Sure, same as it always was. So we just go here. We find here's our price that we're charging right there. So all of this is my consumer surplus. If you got your rule for perfect competition, you got your rule for monopoly. Nothing new there. Didn't do a good job filling that in. Fix that. Go all the way to the axes. Go all the way to the where price is. Filled in well. Okay. Now, the producer surplus is a little bit different here. All right, so what we've got to do here for producer surplus, I'm going to go ahead and just do like I did before. I'm going to run my demand curve and my marginal revenue curve all the way up like we did. But I'm also going to go ahead and finish out my marginal cost curve, because for an individual firm, you remember the marginal cost curve is the supply curve. Here, we're going to kind of transform and say, okay, the marginal cost curve would be like the supply curve for monopoly. Even though monopolist doesn't have a supply curve, even though we know that that point right there is their supply point, we just kind of forget about that here and say, hey, the marginal cost curve is like the supply curve. And since it's like the supply curve, to find producer surplus, we always go from price down to the supply curve. So the producer surplus is a big, weird, strange area. So that's your producer surplus. You're just using the marginal cost curve as, saying, violating our rule from earlier. We're just saying, hey, the marginal cost is a supply curve, even though it's not, and we're defining our producer surplus there. So the question is, would we ever have to calculate that? And the answer is no, not as drawn, because you would need calculus to do so. I imagine, and they do strange things. They'll, and you'll see this on the practice for response questions. They have some where they'll draw. There was one where they drew it and they said, here, this is we had a perfectly elastic average total cost curve, and that was the same thing as marginal cost. Well, if they do that, now we don't have curves down here. We don't have curves that we're trying to calculate. We've got straight lines, so they could do something like this and make you calculate it. Yes, ma'am. Sure. Okay. She said, never mind. Then the other thing that I imagine they could do if they wanted to, and I've never seen this, they could make the marginal cost curve looks like that, in which case then you would have a triangle and a square to calculate. But you can deal with that, whatever they do. All right, what are your questions? So what's that leave us? Consumer surplus, producer surplus, and deadweight loss. Yes, let's take a look at deadweight loss here. All right, so to figure out deadweight loss here, what you've got to do is you've got to go ahead and look at this guy if this were a perfect competitive market. If this were a perfect competitive market, okay, coming over here to the side again, we've got our supply and our demand curves here. This marginal cost here is the sum of all the individual firms' supply curves, okay, or their individual marginal cost curves. So this marginal cost curve becomes the supply. So if this were a perfect competitor, and you don't need to mark your graph up for this because I got this all drawn for you like this, okay, but I want to show it to you here. If this were a perfect competitor, perfect competitive market, not firm, perfect competitive market, supply and demand intersects right there. So if this were perfect competition, the quantity sold would be there. And the price would be there. Everybody see that? It's not there because this is a monopoly. The monopolist produces prices up there and produces right here. So the monopoly is actually restricting output. It's producing less. Okay, it's restricting output and it's charging a higher price. This is one of the things that makes monopolists evil. Okay, monopolists are evil because they restrict output. They charge a higher price than a perfect competitor. They're not allocated efficient and they're not productive efficient. And the last one is they create deadweight loss. So all we gotta do is figure out the deadweight loss. And if you take the magic deadweight loss tool right here, if you take the magic deadweight loss tool, just point to where we are. Okay, we're right here. Okay, we're at this point right there. Where do we want to be? We want to be at that point right there, cover it up, and the part that you cover up is deadweight loss. Okay, deadweight loss is where they are restricting output, and by doing so, society is losing out. What is society losing out here? Surplus. They're losing surplus. It's inefficient. It's inefficient, and society is losing out. Consumer surplus, producer surplus. That's our deadweight loss. Yes. All right, what are your questions? Deadweight loss. Okay, if we put it all together, this is a graph here, a chart that someone else has drawn for me. And this is kind of fancy. All right, QC, when you look at this, QC is the perfect competition quantity, right? PC is the perfect competition price. QM is the monopoly quantity, and PM is the monopoly price. So you can kind of acclimate where you are on this thing here. Had this been a perfect competitor, then the producer surplus would have been all of that, and the consumer surplus would have been everything down here, right? Had it been perfect competition, right? And there'd be no deadweight loss. Did I say something wrong? Okay, the consumer surplus, thank you, I did say it backwards, okay. The top part would be consumer surplus, and the bottom part would be producer surplus, right? So the green part would be consumer surplus, and the red part would be producer surplus. Had it been a perfect competitor. But it's not a perfect competitor, instead it's monopoly. So monopolists, again, they restrict output, so the quantity we're going to produce is now way back here, and the price is going to be higher. They restrict output, charge a higher price. They steal this part of our producer surplus. They steal that from us. Their producer surplus expands. That's what it says right there. So we lose out on this. Now, they create this area right in here, which is the dead weight loss. And this is, again, another reason why they're evil, is because they create this inefficiency loss, which is what a dead weight loss is. So this is just kind of a fancy way of showing everything and the difference between a monopoly and a perfect competitor. Fairly common type thing where you have to compare and contrast the two. Right. So if you compare the two, the monopolist is going to produce less at a higher price, and that's what creates all that dead weight loss. What are your questions?